evening. My guest this evening is Father Andrew Greeley, and those of you may remember that he had a column running in the Tucson Citizen. He is a sociology professor at the University of Arizona. He is with the National Opinion Research Center in Chicago, but right now he is the author of a best-selling book, Thy Brother's Wife. Welcome to the show.
It's nice to be here again, Ellen.
There's so much to talk about. We get to do this show once a year, and I keep thinking of questions to ask you all year long. Your book is a bestseller.
Yes, top of the New York Times bestseller list now. Near the top.
Is that highly unusual for a priest to write fiction, and then, well, because the fact that you're a good writer, for that fiction to sell like hotcakes?
Well, priests have written novels before. Cardinal Newman, Cardinal Wiseman, the last century, Monsignor Knox wrote mystery stories. Rabelais was a priest, the author of Gargantua. I don't know that they had bestseller lists in his day, but it certainly is a classic.
Why do you write?
Well, I write because I like to write. I enjoy writing. But I also write because for the same reason I suppose that they made stained glass windows or cathedrals in the Middle Ages. I think that stories are the best way. They've always been the best way of talking about religion. So I write stories, novels. God is sort of the main, if usually invisible, character. For the same reason that in the Jewish scriptures we have stories about people like David and Joseph, and in the Christian scriptures Jesus told parables. Stories are a way you can present religion and track the whole personality instead of just the human intellect.
When people read your book, well, it's interesting. I imagine if people start out reading your book, depending on where they're coming from. Now, I started out as a non-Catholic reading your book, and I enjoyed the book very much.
Thank you. You have great taste.
Yes, I do. Took it on vacation, and everybody went to bed for another hard day of skiing, and I was up reading, and I really didn't want to put it down. It's
good. That's the highest compliment you can pay to a writer, to say a story is a good story.
Yes. But I was seeing other things in the characters. I was seeing a similarity to the Kennedy family. Mm-hmm. I was seeing, in fact, almost to me, a complete down the line. I saw Joseph Kennedy, who wanted one son to be a priest and another to be president of the country. Then one of the sons in the book has a flaw, or a major flaw, like he has no morality. That's a small flaw that keeps getting him in trouble, and there were comparables with the Kennedy family. And yet, the real comparable, I find out after reading the book and so forth, with all the publicity, is that so many people say that it's written as that's Archbishop Cody, who recently died, and that's his story in that book.
No, it is neither the Cardinal nor the Kennedys. You see, Joe Kennedy wasn't the only Irish parent of that generation to try to achieve through his children the respectability that his own money couldn't buy. And I really thought of the story as a story of two Chicagoans who came from a similar family indeed, but there were tens of thousands of such families where the parents wanted the kids to succeed in order to win for them respectability. So one son was programmed to be a priest, one son to be a politician. Many Irish families did that. And so it wasn't particularly the Kennedys I had in mind at all. In fact, the Kennedys are characters in the book. Bobby Kennedy especially is a good friend of the senator who was before he becomes a senator. And certainly there is no similarity at all between Sean Cronin, the hero of Thy Brother's Wife, and Cardinal Cody. He's a very different kind of person.
Well, person-wise, but I think people were reading into it the fact that there was a love affair between the cardinal and a woman, and the fact that Sean was influenced by a woman greatly, that they were drawing. Mm-hmm. Plus, you also talk about accounting procedures in the book and how they need to be corrected and so on, and one of the fathers is saying that about some. I think people could draw.
Well, only if they didn't know Chicago very well, I would think they might see some similarity, but the relationship, I don't know what the relationship was like between the late Cardinal and Mrs. Wilson. I don't think it was anything like the relationship between Sean Cronin in my novel and Nora, his brother's wife. And Nora is really the main character of the book. She's the one that carries the sort of main theme of the book. She reflects the womanliness of God. Nora is a mystic. 3 times in the course of the book she has mystical experiences in which she encounters a loving presence. And the 3rd time she finds this presence kind of laughing at her, not laughing in anger, but laughing in amusement. And she realizes that that the presence is laughing at her the way she laughs at her teenage daughter Noreen. And she says, oh, she says, everyone wants to be a mother, even you. So the book is really, it's a story of God, a theological novel, and it's a story of God as woman. Now there's all kinds of other things. There's politics, there's sin, there's forgiveness, there's life, there's death. But they're all orchestrated around the theme of our commitments to one another, imperfectly made and imperfectly kept, but still kept. And God's basic commitment to us, a commitment of passionate love, which underpins all of our commitments. You don't have to see those things explicitly. They're there. And if you like the story, enjoy the story, those things get transferred to my imagination, to your imagination.
Well, we'll leave your imagination right now. We'll come back right after this message. My guest is Father Andrew Greeley. I just want to quote from your afterword in the book. You said, "This particular religious story will be successful if the reader is disconcerted by a tale of commitments that are imperfectly made and imperfectly kept, but that are still kept, and by the image of a God who draws straight with crooked lines, who easily and quickly forgives, and who wants to love us with the tenderness of a mother."
Well, I think the womanliness of God is an idea, an image, a picture whose time has come. Bob Fosse in the movie All That Jazz had Jessica Lange playing God. And 1/4 of the young Catholics in the country, and I'm sure the same thing would be true of young Protestants and young Jews too, say that at least sometimes they imagine God as a mother. So I think the traditional notion of God being masculine and feminine together, mother and father together, is going to come back into prominence, and maybe more prominence than it's ever had before. And we're going to think more and more of God's maternal as well as paternal love. One of the reasons for putting a personal afterword in the book is most authors don't do it, but I get, because I'm a priest, I get harassed. People say, what's a priest doing in a novel? Why do you write that book? So I now explain why I write it. And reviewers that don't like me distort that anyhow, so you can't win.
The notion that God is a woman, if it's been my experience that the way you can tell a really hardcore male chauvinist pig is to somewhere in a conversation throw out the line and refer to God as she, and watch their faces explode.
The evidence in our...
Including women, not only men, but women too.
The worst chauvinists in the world are women. But in the research we've done, it's pretty clear that men need the image of God as women more than women do. It's easier to relate to a God who is of the opposite sex than you. And the image of God as a woman doesn't affect a woman's spiritual life much. It has an enormous positive effect on a man's life. He prays more. He's more likely to think of God as a lover. He's more likely to be involved in social and political activities. And he's got a better relationship with his wife if he thinks of God as a woman. So or pictures God as a mother. It's a very, very important symbol in the religious life of a man.
You are known as a feminist.
Of a sort, yeah. I'm an Irishman. I got no choice. My mother and my sister said, be a feminist. And I says, all right, I'll be a feminist.
Yet the protagonists in your stories, they aren't women.
No, that's true. Both the Cardinal Sins and My Brother's Wife, the protagonists are men. In the next book, which is, I think, going to be called Descent into Hell, the protagonist is a man, too. Though I think in all three books, Ellen Foley in the first one, Nora Cronin in this one, and Maria Manfredi, that was Sicilian heroine in the next one, they're all very strong people. However, in the fourth novel, which is now kind of just at the outline stage, it's called Lord of the Dance, the protagonist is going to be a 17-year-old girl named Noelle. Noelle, because she was born on Christmas. And so I'm going to honor that part of my feminist principles and have a woman protagonist.
The next question that comes to mind, people who now know of your great success as a novelist say, how are you allowed to do that within the Catholic Church? I.e., you're making so much money from the books, or I assume you are. And B, I'm not terribly sure as a priest, do you not have to have a parish and administer to a flock, so to speak? So how do you have the freedom to be a sociologist?
Priests really, down through human history, have done almost everything. They've been geographers and generals and politicians and explorers and philosophers and theologians. The church has always felt that wherever a priest is, he represents the church and he's doing priestly work. I was assigned to be a university professor and a sociologist by Cardinal 16, 17 years ago now. And my writing and my research and my teaching is all part of that assignment. So it is priestly work. I think writing stories about God, mass market stories especially, is as priestly as preaching a Sunday sermon. I do parish work on weekends. Last weekend I said Mass 3 times, and I like that kind of thing. I'm happy with it. But I think this other work is priestly too. And the church has always, at least almost always, been very liberal in its definition of what priests can and should do. As for the money, I don't have a vow of poverty, so that means it's my own responsibility and not a religious order's as to how I practice generosity. And I'm going to try to be generous. The income hasn't got that enormous yet. It might, and then I'm going to have a real responsibility to be generous.
I'm afraid I don't quite understand what you meant by vow of poverty.
If you're a religious order priest, a Jesuit or a Dominican or something of the sort, Franciscan, you make a solemn vow that you will not own anything or take any money. Any money you make, you turn over to a religious order, and it's their responsibility. Those of us who are diocesan priests that don't belong to religious orders, the money we make, we are bound to be generous with it, but our obligation of generosity is the same as any baptized Catholic layman, which means we have to be very generous. But we make our decisions. The religious order doesn't make them for us.
As far as your salary for your day-to-day life, does the church pay you to...
No.
Nothing
the church hasn't paid me a penny in 15 years. I'm paid by the university or by the publisher or by the foundations that are funding my research. I
see. Okay, that cleared that part up. Now we have to talk about the sex in your novel.
Well, it's very...
It was good. I really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you. An awful lot of Catholic reviewers are very snotty about it. They say, well, it's clear he doesn't know anything about sex. I'm glad to hear a non-Catholic woman say that she thought the sex scenes were reasonably well written.
As a matter of fact, I went, my goodness, that because you have a scene in there, or you have a situation where you have where the bad guy has not only had an affair with the mother, but then he ends up having an affair with the daughter also, which leads to his downfall. And I said, why, that sneaky so-and-so, look what he's done. He's put the male fantasy of sexual involvement with the mother and the daughter right into his book. I thought you were a stinker.
Well, to begin with, I don't think the eroticism in my novels is nearly as powerful, say, as the Song of Solomon in the Jewish scriptures. It's very low-key. It's parental guidance sex. And then secondly, the reason for having it there is really the same reason it is in the Song of Songs in the scriptures, because the passion of our love for one another as human beings is a reflection, a pale, thin reflection of the passion of God's love for us. So that's why I think you really have to have some kind of passion in novels today, not to appeal to the market, but to reflect the fact that sex is a sacrament of God's love for us. Sex reveals to us how intensely God loves us, and that's why they're in the books. A lot of people say, how does a priest, what does a priest know about those things? Well, my facetious response is, that's my affair. But the serious response is, look, priests are human beings. They have hormones. They have fantasies. They understand what the human condition is about. You don't, when you're writing stories, you don't write necessarily autobiography. You write one imagination linking up to another person's imagination. Their works exercises in imagination and not in autobiography, necessarily.
We'll be back in one moment. Father Andrew Greeley is my guest. Father Greeley, I told you how I've enjoyed the book, and I'm in the non-Catholic category. Have you found any difference in reaction between Catholics and non-Catholics?
Well, among the ordinary readers, the people that write letters, both groups seem to enjoy the story. I think probably the worst criticism comes from the clergy. One archbishop said to me, I liked your book. It's a good story. He says, it's a good read. And I see the point. He says, most of my priests really are very angry at it. He says, they don't like it. He says, of course, they haven't read it. So there's some just sort of basic resentment among some clergy that the book is successful. There's a certain kind of old-fashioned Catholic layperson that doesn't like it. But I think probably the worst reviews come from liberal Catholics, mildly alienated liberal Catholics, who are furious that a priest would write a successful book. They're the worst of the critics.
Because you wrote a successful book, or because you dared to take on the foibles of the church?
No, I think it's just a priest writing a novel in which there's some sex, a novel about the love between men and women, and a novel that succeeds. A novel that, 2.7 million copies are sold as in the Cardinal Sins. Boy, they really can get very, very nasty. One review, it was in the Arizona Republic and the Chicago Sun-Times, both. It was 18 paragraphs in it, and the reviewer spent 14 in personal vituperation and 4 on the book. So when a priest ventures forth to do something like this, he's likely to get clobbered quite a bit.
That I must ask this question, and I hope it will turn out clearly to our audience. I have not seen the Phil Donahue show in which you appeared yet, but I understand from someone who watched it that Donahue claimed that the Chicago Sun-Times, it came out in the show that the notes that the the Sun-Times reporter who broke the story about Archbishop Cody, that he had stolen your tape recordings and your notes. Well, now, whatever is erroneous about that, please clear up.
I had a bunch of notes that I took when I was doing a book on the papal election, and a reporter from the Notre Dame University magazine stole those notes and tried to peddle them in Chicago when Notre Dame magazine wouldn't publish them. And finally, when the Sun-Times broke its story about the Cardinal, then a small Chicago paper picked up my stolen notes to try and prove that I had engineered the Sun-Times expose. And my notes were 7 years old. If it was an attempt to plot with the Sun-Times, it took 7 years to activate it. And of course, it had nothing to do with the Sun-Times investigation. And I don't know why Donahue brought it up. I think he was out to get me. He didn't, however.
I can't wait to see that show. We were chatting beforehand, and apparently you two really went at it on that show. And it reminds me how two people of the same religious group always have at each other with much more vehemence than somebody from another religious group.
Yeah, well, Phil's an alienated Catholic, which is to say he's somebody who will never really be able to leave the church, but will have a long, hard time finding peace with the church. And he's just angry at anyone who's a priest. I mean, when I become on the program, even though I've written a novel about the womanliness of God, something which Phil ought to have agreed with.
As a feminist.
I was a priest in his parish when he was a little boy, and he was going to get even with me for all the things the priests in his parish had done to him when he was a little boy. Makes for great theater, I don't think it clarifies anything. It's not a pleasant experience, but it's great entertainment for the viewers.
The minute he saw your black suit, that was
it activated all kinds of things in his head. I think it does with a fair number of people. One of the purpose, of course, of writing these novels, and the first 3 of them are about priests, is to present priests in a much more human light. People like Phil grew up in an environment where priests were thought to be perfect, and perceiving them then as imperfect made them very angry. Well, now in these novels, I'm trying to present priests as humans who have both weaknesses and strengths, flaws and virtues. I think priests are much more attractive if they're human instead of being presented as superhuman. If you try to make a priest look superhuman, or a rabbi, or any religious leader, you end up making him look inhuman and subhuman.
That's one of the things that I really liked about the book, because I don't know how much to tell because we want everybody to read it. But Sean ends up as the Archbishop or the Bishop of...
Well, he's about to be made Archbishop of Chicago.
Of Chicago. Yeah. And yet throughout the book, he is always talking to God, and he is always saying, are you really there?
Demanding signs.
Yes, you tell me.
You give me a sign. And then at the end, when he finally realizes that Nora's love has been the sign he's had all his life, he scrawls in his little book, you damn fool, you missed the sign all along. Well, one Catholic reviewer criticizes those. He says those are terrible prayers. I don't think they're terrible prayers. I think delivering ultimatum to God are good ideas. At least you care about God. And then at the end, I think a beautiful prayer to say, oh my God, you should excuse the expression, I missed it all along. I'm sorry. You did love me all along, and I never realized it. I think that's a wonderful prayer.
Well, that's exactly what I liked about the book, because as ordinary people, you go along and you sometimes doubt the existence of a God, and you have all kinds of mixed up, befuddled thoughts, and it was comforting to me to see a person who is high in the priesthood having those very same thoughts.
Well, see, Sean and Nora are friends for 30 years, and they love one another for 30 years. Okay, so there's 2 weeks of sin, and a lot of Catholics want them to be condemned for that. One reviewer wanted Nora to have to go into a convent to expiate for her sin. And my point is, well, I don't approve of the sin, but you got to judge a relationship by its totality and not by one interlude. And then God drawing straight with crooked lines. enables them both to grow as a result of their mistakes, so he becomes a better priest and a better bishop, and she becomes a stronger woman.
But didn't you, my feeling on that was that you did have them punished, because the child that I read was born of that union, and you left us particularly vague, but we could draw our own conclusions, mysteriously died from a disease that attacks 1 in a million.
Leukemia. I don't know whose father the child was.
I do. I read it, and I know.
But you see, yes, both of them believe that that's a punishment. And one of the things Nora has to realize before the presence is present for her again is it wasn't a punishment, that God doesn't punish that way. And that the guilt and punishment and forgiveness, God's love is so powerful that issues like guilt and punishment and forgiveness fall away once we just turn and accept God's love. So, yeah, I had that there so they would call it punishment, but then she would realize she had to give up even the notion of punishment to accept God's love again.
We'll be back in a moment. Father Andrew Greeley is my guest this evening. Father Greeley, let's just switch off the book. I have a quote here, and I think I can get by with it on television, because it is a quote. It says, well, it's quoting you. It says, "Oh, sure, I've had bishops and archbishops take me aside and say, 'You son of a bitch, don't ever stop. I can't agree with you publicly, but keep us honest.'"
Well, I think that's all someone like me can expect. I mean, I'm a priest. I'm going to be a priest for the rest of my life, and because of a lot of circumstances, mostly accidental, I'm in a position where I'm free to say things that a lot of people feel, but are not in a position to say. And so, of course, priests and especially bishops who realize the importance of having a critical voice will encourage you privately. They can't afford, and they shouldn't afford, really, to appear to endorse you in public, but behind the scenes, they'll say, keep it up, keep it up. One bishop's a very close friend of mine. He read My Brother's Wife, and he says, hey, he says, this is supposed to be a steamy book. He says, I read the first 180 pages. Can't have a single dirty thought. Greeley, he says, you're slipping. But he also said in a more serious point once, he says, Greeley, if you ever leave the priesthood, I'm going to come and find you, and I'm going to beat the hell out of you. Well, I said, I'm never going to leave the priesthood. He said, you make sure you don't leave the priesthood. That's enough for me. I mean, anybody that does the things I do and writes books and writes columns and does social research has to be prepared to be out in the open and take an awful lot of heat. That's okay. If the support is behind the scenes, fine. I welcome it wherever it comes.
But don't you sort of attack it as a kind of a little leprechaun, and you take your paintbrush and you make an all-inclusive statement, and so that you purposely will anger people so that they will say,
well, it depends. I mean, if you're writing a column, in a 750-word column, your main job is to challenge people to think. If you're doing a careful sociological research, you throw in all the nuances. If you're writing a novel, you've got symbols and pictures and stories running all over the place. So I think it depends on the literary form. No, I don't like to make trouble, especially, and I don't like to be in trouble. But I think if you're doing a column, you've got to be somewhat contentious.
Well, I've enjoyed having you this evening.
It's always nice to be here, Anna.
Come back next year.
I shall.
Another book next year?
Another novel next year.
Okay. My guest has been Father Andrew Greeley.